The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Millbrook Creek as the most extraordinary sight in the town's 30-year history rolled into view. A gleaming silver automobile, its brass fixtures catching the light like jewels, moved slowly past the weathered storefronts and wooden sidewalks. Behind the wheel sat a woman whose very presence seemed to challenge everything the frontier settlement thought it knew about power, wealth, and social order. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Victoria Blackwood stepped from the vehicle with fluid grace. Her emerald traveling dress, a masterpiece of tailored perfection that cost more than most families in Millbrook Creek earned in 3 years. The fabric whispered against itself as she moved, a sound of luxury that seemed almost foreign in the dusty streets where horses still outnumbered automobiles 100 to 1. Her auburn hair was swept into an elaborate arrangement that spoke of professional styling from the finest salons back east, and her gloved hands moved with the practiced elegance of someone accustomed to commanding rooms full of powerful men. But it was her eyes that made old Thomas Garrett drop his coffee cup right there on the general store steps, the ceramic shattering against the worn wood as recognition dawned in his weathered features. Those eyes, brilliant amber with flecks of gold, belonged to someone he had known long ago, someone the town had tried very hard to forget. They carried the same defiant intelligence that had unsettled the community's leaders 15 years earlier, when they had belonged to a desperate child who refused to bow her head in shame. The woman surveyed Millbrook Creek with the cool assessment of a general studying a battlefield, noting changes and improvements with the sharp attention of someone who had intimate knowledge of how things used to be. The main street had been widened and partially paved. The old church had been rebuilt with a proper bell tower. Several new businesses displayed fresh paint and modern signage. The town had clearly prospered in the years since her departure, growing from a struggling frontier outpost into something approaching respectability. She moved toward the Millbrook Creek Hotel, the finest accommodation in town, though even its pretensions to elegance paled in comparison to the sophisticated establishments she now called home in cities like San Francisco and Denver. The clerk behind the reception desk stammered through his welcome speech, clearly overwhelmed by the unexpected arrival of such obvious wealth and refinement. Victoria Blackwood had reserved the entire top floor for an indefinite stay, paying in advance with gold certificates that represented more money than the hotel typically saw in 6 months. Word of her arrival spread through Millbrook Creek like wildfire through dry grass. By noon, every household was buzzing with speculation about the mysterious woman who had descended upon them like some fairy tale princess, bringing with her an aura of sophistication that made their frontier settlement feel suddenly small and provincial. The ladies gathered in parlors and at garden gates, dissecting every detail of her appearance and trying to place her accent, which carried hints of Eastern refinement layered over something that sounded suspiciously familiar. Margaret Sullivan, the banker's wife and undisputed queen of Millbrook Creek society, had positioned herself at her front window with opera glasses borrowed from the church for special occasions. She studied the elegant stranger with the intensity of a scientist examining a rare specimen, noting the quality of her jewelry, the cut of her dress, and the confidence with which she carried herself through streets that should have been alien to her. "There's something familiar about her," Margaret murmured to her sister, who had rushed over the moment word reached her about the arrival. "Something about the way she holds her head, the set of her shoulders. I feel as though I should know her from somewhere." Down at the livery stable, men gathered around Henry Morrison as he recounted his brief interaction with the mysterious visitor, when she had inquired about stabling facilities for her automobile. He described her voice as cultured but carrying undertones that reminded him of someone from long ago, though he couldn't quite place the memory that teased at the edges of his consciousness. "She knew exactly where she was going," Henry reported to the fascinated audience. Didn't need directions to the hotel. Didn't ask about the best places to eat or shop. Moved through town like she'd walked these streets 1,000 times before. But I'll be damned if I can remember ever seeing someone like that in Millbrook Creek. The schoolmaster, Professor William Hayes, had caught a glimpse of her through his classroom window and found himself strangely unsettled by the encounter. Something about her profile, the angle of her jaw, triggered memories he couldn't quite grasp. He had lived in Millbrook Creek for 20 years, teaching the children of farmers, merchants, and cattlemen, and prided himself on remembering everyone who had passed through his schoolhouse. Yet this woman's face suggested connections he couldn't quite make. At the newspaper office, editor Jonathan Pierce was already composing the story that would appear in the next edition of the Millbrook Creek Gazette. The arrival of such obvious wealth and sophistication represented the biggest news the town had seen since the railroad survey had come through 3 years earlier. But as he wrote, Pierce found himself struggling with the same nagging sense of recognition that was plaguing others throughout the community. Victoria Blackwood spent her first afternoon in Millbrook Creek conducting what appeared to be a leisurely tour of the town's improvements and developments. She walked the main street with measured steps, pausing to observe the new businesses, the expanded church, and the recently constructed courthouse. But her tour was far from casual. Every stop was calculated, every observation purposeful. She was conducting reconnaissance, gathering intelligence about how the community had evolved in her absence. She paused for a particularly long time outside Sullivan Bank and Trust, studying the imposing brick building that dominated the corner of Main and Church Streets. The bank had clearly prospered, expanding into the adjacent building and adding architectural details that spoke to increased wealth and influence. Through the large windows, she could see men in suits conducting business with the grave importance that financial transactions commanded in a frontier community where money remained relatively scarce. The sight of the bank seemed to trigger something in Victoria's expression, a subtle hardening around her eyes that suggested old grievances and carefully nursed resentments. She stood there for several minutes, her gaze fixed on the brass nameplate that proclaimed Patrick Sullivan, President, in letters that caught the afternoon sunlight. Then she smiled, but it was not the expression of someone remembering pleasant times. It was the smile of a chess player who had just recognized the opening moves of a game she intended to win. Her next stop was the general store, where she made small purchases with the easy grace of someone accustomed to being waited upon by eager clerks. The proprietor, Michael Chun, had taken over the business from the previous owner 5 years earlier and prided himself on carrying goods that rivaled those available in much larger cities. But even his finest merchandise seemed ordinary compared to the obvious quality of everything Victoria Blackwood wore or carried. "We don't often see visitors of your caliber in Millbrook Creek," Michael ventured as he wrapped her purchases in brown paper. "Are you perhaps considering investment opportunities in our community? We've been growing steadily, and the railroad survey suggests we might see significant development in the coming years." Victoria's smile was polite but non-committal. "I'm exploring various possibilities," she replied, her voice carrying the cultured tones of someone educated in the finest schools. "I have heard interesting things about Millbrook Creek's potential for growth and development. I thought it wise to see the community for myself before making any commitments." The conversation was perfectly ordinary, the kind of exchange that might occur between any prospective investor and local merchant. But something in Victoria's tone suggested layers of meaning that Michael couldn't quite grasp. She spoke about the town with the familiarity of someone who knew its history intimately, yet presented herself as a stranger evaluating opportunities. The contradiction was subtle but unsettling. As evening approached, Victoria returned to the hotel and requested a table in the dining room that would allow her to observe the comings and goings of Millbrook Creek's prominent citizens. The hotel restaurant served as an unofficial social center for the town's elite, particularly during the dinner hour when business leaders and their families gathered to discuss the day's events and the community's future prospects. She dined alone, but her presence dominated the room in ways that made other conversations seem suddenly artificial and strained. Men who had built their reputations on frontier confidence found themselves stealing glances at the elegant stranger, while their wives struggled to maintain their own sense of social superiority in the face of such obvious refinement. Victoria seemed completely unaware of the attention she was attracting, focusing on her meal with the composed dignity of someone accustomed to being the most interesting person in any room. Patrick Sullivan entered the dining room precisely at 7 o'clock, his routine unchanged for the past decade. As president of the town's only bank and its most influential citizen, he commanded immediate attention wherever he went. His wife Margaret followed a respectful step behind, her dress representing the height of fashion as understood in Millbrook Creek, though it paled in comparison to Victoria's effortless elegance. The banker's eyes found Victoria immediately, and she watched with subtle amusement as recognition warred with disbelief in his expression. Patrick Sullivan was a man who prided himself on remembering faces and placing connections, skills that had served him well in building his financial empire. But the woman sitting alone at the corner table presented him with a puzzle that challenged everything he thought he knew about his own community. Victoria rose from her seat with fluid grace and approached the Sullivan table with the confidence of someone accustomed to introducing herself to powerful men. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, extending a gloved hand. "I'm Victoria Blackwood. I believe you may remember me, though I suspect I've changed considerably since our last encounter." Patrick Sullivan took her hand automatically, his banker's instincts for social politeness overriding his growing confusion. The name meant nothing to him, but something about her voice, her bearing, the particular shade of her eyes triggered memories that remained frustratingly just beyond his conscious reach. "Miss Blackwood," he replied carefully, "I must confess, you have me at a disadvantage. While you seem familiar, I cannot quite place our previous meeting. Perhaps you could refresh my memory?" Victoria's smile was enigmatic, holding secrets that seemed to dance just behind her eyes. "I'm not surprised you don't immediately recognize me, Mr. Sullivan. People can change dramatically when circumstances force them to grow beyond their original limitations. Sometimes a butterfly emerges so transformed that those who knew the caterpillar failed to see the connection." The metaphor was delivered with perfect politeness, but something in her tone made Patrick Sullivan's stomach tighten. With undefined apprehension, there was a challenge buried in her words, a suggestion that their shared history contained elements he might prefer to keep buried. Margaret Sullivan, who had been studying Victoria with the intense focus of a woman defending her social territory, spoke up with forced brightness. "How lovely to have such a distinguished visitor in our little town. Are you perhaps traveling through to Denver or San Francisco? We so rarely have the pleasure of meeting ladies of obvious refinement and education." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Actually," Victoria replied, her gaze never leaving Patrick Sullivan's increasingly uncomfortable face, "I'm considering making Millbrook Creek my permanent home. I have developed a considerable interest in this community's future, and I believe I may have significant contributions to make to its continued development and prosperity." The statement sent ripples of shock through the dining room, where other patrons had been straining to overhear the conversation between their leading citizen and the mysterious stranger. The idea that someone of Victoria Blackwood's obvious wealth and sophistication might choose to settle permanently in their frontier town was almost too extraordinary to believe. But Patrick Sullivan heard something else in her declaration, a note of challenge that suggested her interest in Millbrook Creek might not be entirely benevolent. As a banker, he had developed keen instincts for detecting threats to his carefully constructed empire, and every sense he possessed was now screaming warnings about the elegant woman who stood before him, claiming half-remembered familiarity. Victoria returned to her table, leaving the Sullivan family to process the implications of their brief encounter. She had planted the seeds of recognition without allowing them to bloom into full understanding, creating exactly the kind of psychological pressure that would keep them off balance while she prepared for the more dramatic revelations to come. As the evening progressed, other prominent citizens approached her table with varying degrees of curiosity and social ambition. Each conversation followed similar patterns: polite inquiries about her background and intentions, met with responses that provided just enough information to be tantalizing, while withholding the crucial details that would explain her true identity and purpose. Dr. Samuel Richardson, the town's physician, found himself particularly intrigued by Victoria's apparent familiarity with medical terminology and her knowledgeable questions about the community's health services. Judge Harrison Porter was impressed by her understanding of legal precedents and territorial law. Even Reverend Timothy Walsh discovered that she could discuss theological philosophy with the sophistication of someone educated in the finest seminaries. Each interaction revealed another facet of Victoria Blackwood's remarkable education and experience, building a portrait of someone whose capabilities far exceeded what anyone would expect from a typical frontier visitor. Yet the more accomplished she proved to be, the more puzzling became the question of why someone with her obvious advantages would choose to settle in a remote town like Millbrook Creek. By the time she retired to her suite for the evening, Victoria had successfully introduced herself to every person of significance in the community while maintaining the mystery that would keep them speculating about her true identity and intentions. She had studied their faces, cataloged their reactions, and begun the psychological groundwork for the confrontation that would reshape Millbrook Creek's understanding of power, justice, and moral accountability. Standing at her window overlooking the town that had once cast her out in shame, Victoria Blackwood smiled with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had spent 15 years preparing for this moment. The frightened, powerless girl who had once been known by another name was gone forever, replaced by a woman with the resources and determination to transform an entire community. According to her own vision of justice, tomorrow would bring new opportunities to tighten the web of recognition and anticipation she was weaving around Millbrook Creek's elite. But tonight, she would savor the sweet irony of being welcomed as an honored guest by the same people who had once considered her beneath their notice. The game had begun, and Victoria Blackwood intended to win it completely. 15 years earlier, in the bitter winter of 1889, 12-year-old Charlotte Murphy lived in circumstances that would have broken the spirit of most children her age. Her world consisted of a leaking one-room cabin on the outskirts of Millbrook Creek, where icy winds whistled through gaps in the chinked logs, and snow often drifted across the dirt floor during the worst storms. The cabin sat on a worthless piece of land that her father, Daniel Murphy, had claimed in a moment of drunken optimism before abandoning his family to chase gold rumors in California. Charlotte's mother, Rose Murphy, worked herself to exhaustion taking in laundry for the town's more prosperous families, her hands cracked and bleeding from constant exposure to lye soap and freezing water. Despite her relentless efforts, there was never quite enough money for proper food, warm clothing, or the small comforts that other children took for granted. Charlotte had learned early not to complain about the constant hunger that gnawed at her belly or the way her thin shoes let in snow during the long walk to the schoolhouse. But what set Charlotte apart from other children in similar circumstances was not her poverty. Frontier towns were full of struggling families. It was her extraordinary mind and her absolute refusal to accept that circumstances of birth should determine the limits of human potential. While other girls her age focused on learning basic household skills and preparing for early marriage, Charlotte devoured every book she could find with the desperate hunger of someone who understood that knowledge was the only pathway to a different kind of life. The schoolhouse in Millbrook Creek was a crude affair, little more than a drafty wooden building with rough-hewn benches and a pot-bellied stove that never quite managed to warm the entire space. Most children attended sporadically when farm work or family responsibilities permitted, and the teacher, Miss Anna Foster, had grown accustomed to low expectations and shorter attention spans. But Charlotte Murphy was different. She arrived early every morning, regardless of weather, and stayed late to help clean the classroom in exchange for permission to borrow books from Miss Foster's small personal library. Miss Foster, an educated woman from Massachusetts who had come west to escape a family scandal, quickly recognized Charlotte's exceptional abilities. The girl could read at a level that surpassed children several years older, and her mathematical aptitude was remarkable for someone with no formal tutoring. More importantly, Charlotte possessed a quality that Miss Foster found both admirable and concerning: an intense intellectual curiosity that refused to be constrained by social expectations about what young girls from poor families should or should not learn. "Charlotte has a mind like a steel trap," Miss Foster confided to Dr. Samuel Richardson during one of their occasional conversations about the children's welfare. "She absorbs information faster than I can provide it, and she asks questions that challenge even my understanding. In a different time and place, she could become anything she chose to be: a teacher, a physician, perhaps even a lawyer. But here, in these circumstances... The Dr. Richardson nodded gravely. He had noticed Charlotte during his visits to treat various ailments among the town's children. She was always the one asking detailed questions about symptoms, treatments, and the reasoning behind his medical decisions. Her questions displayed an understanding of cause and effect that impressed him, along with a fierce desire to comprehend the world around her in all its complexity. It was Dr. Richardson who offered Charlotte an opportunity that would change the trajectory of her young life. His regular assistant had moved to Denver to care for an aging parent, leaving him without help in managing his practice. Charlotte's obvious intelligence and her steady presence around the clinic made her a natural choice for the position. Despite her age and gender, the arrangement began modestly. Charlotte would help organize his medical supplies, clean instruments, and assist with basic preparations after school hours and on weekends. In exchange, Dr. Richardson would provide her with a small wage and access to his extensive medical library, which contained texts that covered everything from anatomy to pharmacology to surgical procedures. Charlotte threw herself into this work with the same intensity she brought to her studies. She memorized the names and properties of every medicine in Dr. Richardson's cabinet, learned to prepare poultices and tinctures with precise measurements, and developed such steady hands that the doctor began allowing her to assist with minor procedures. More importantly, she began to understand the human body as a complex system that could be diagnosed, treated, and healed through the application of scientific knowledge. The arrangement worked beautifully until the day it attracted the wrong kind of attention from Millbrook Creek's self-appointed moral guardians. Margaret Sullivan, wife of banker Patrick Sullivan, had long disapproved of what she considered the Richardson family's unconventional approaches to child rearing and social propriety. When she learned that the doctor was teaching advanced medical procedures to a 12-year-old girl from the town's poorest family, she saw an opportunity to assert her authority over community standards. "It's simply inappropriate," Margaret announced to the ladies' auxiliary during their weekly meeting at the church. "A girl of that age, especially one from such questionable circumstances, has no business learning things that should be reserved for trained medical professionals. What if something goes wrong? What kind of example are we setting for other children?" The criticism might have remained confined to gossip circles, if not for an incident that occurred on a snowy February afternoon when Dr. Richardson was called away to attend a difficult childbirth on a remote ranch. During his absence, 8-year-old Timothy Walsh, the minister's youngest son, was brought to the clinic after falling through thin ice on Miller's Pond. The boy was unconscious, barely breathing. and suffering from severe hypothermia, Charlotte found herself alone with a dying child and a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could wait for Dr. Richardson's return, knowing that Timothy would likely die before help arrived. Or she could apply everything she had learned about emergency treatment for hypothermia, taking actions that would save the boy's life, but expose her to criticism for exceeding her authority. Charlotte chose to act. She worked with methodical precision, warming Timothy gradually to prevent shock, monitoring his breathing, and administering the stimulants that Dr. Richardson had taught her to use in such cases. When the doctor finally returned 3 hours later, he found Timothy Walsh breathing normally, his color returning, and his life no longer in immediate danger. Dr. Richardson praised Charlotte's quick thinking and skilled intervention, crediting her with saving the boy's life. But instead of gratitude, Charlotte found herself facing a storm of controversy from the very people whose children she had potentially saved. How dare a 12-year-old girl, especially one from such humble circumstances, presume to practice medicine? What if her inexperience had made the situation worse? What kind of community allowed children to take such dangerous responsibilities upon themselves? The criticism stung, but Charlotte might have weathered it if not for the attention it attracted from an unexpected source. Edward Sullivan, Patrick Sullivan's eldest son, was 16 years old and had recently returned from 2 years at a prestigious boarding school in Chicago. He was handsome in the effortless way of young men from wealthy families, well-fed, well-dressed, and supremely confident in his place in the world's hierarchy. Edward had been present at the clinic when Timothy Walsh was brought in, having come to seek treatment for a minor injury sustained during a riding accident. He witnessed Charlotte's competent handling of the emergency, watched her work with steady hands and clear thinking under pressure, and found himself impressed by capabilities that seemed far beyond her years and circumstances. More than impressed, he was intrigued. Edward Sullivan had spent 2 years among the daughters of Chicago's elite young women who were beautiful, accomplished, and utterly predictable in their interests and ambitions. Charlotte Murphy represented something entirely different, a girl who possessed extraordinary intelligence, genuine capability, and a fierce independence that made her unlike anyone he had ever encountered. Edward began finding excuses to visit Dr. Richardson's clinic, ostensibly to check on his healing injury, but really to observe Charlotte at work. He brought her small gift books from his father's library, ribbons for her hair, sweets from the general store, and engaged her in conversations that revealed the breadth of her knowledge and the depth of her ambition. For Charlotte, who had never received attention from any of the town's prominent young men, Edward's interest was both exciting and bewildering. "You're different from other girls," Edward told her during one of their conversations in the clinic's storage room, where they could speak privately while she organized medical supplies. "You think about things that matter. You understand that there's a whole world beyond this little town, and you have the intelligence to be part of it." Charlotte had heard similar words from Miss Foster and Dr. Richardson, but coming from Edward Sullivan, heir to one of the territory's most successful banking empires, they carried different weight. Here was someone who moved in circles of power and influence, someone who could potentially open doors that would otherwise remain forever closed to a girl of her background. Edward painted elaborate pictures of the life they could build together. He spoke of traveling to San Francisco and New York, of the cultural opportunities and educational possibilities that awaited in larger cities. He described a future where Charlotte's intelligence would be valued rather than criticized, where her ambitions could flourish rather than being constrained by small-town prejudices and limitations. "My father wants me to study business and eventually take over the bank," Edward confided, "but I've been thinking about law school, maybe even politics. A man in public life needs a wife who can hold her own in sophisticated company, someone who understands important issues and can contribute to meaningful conversations. You could be that woman, Charlotte. You have everything it takes." For a 12-year-old girl who had spent her entire life on the margins of respectable society, Edward's vision was intoxicating. She began to imagine herself as the wife of an important man, using her intelligence and education to influence social policy and community development. The poverty and isolation that had defined her childhood seemed like temporary obstacles that could be overcome through love, determination, and strategic marriage. The relationship developed in secret over several months, with Edward arranging clandestine meetings in the clinic after hours, in the abandoned cabin near Miller's Pond, and in the grove of cottonwood trees behind the schoolhouse. Charlotte treasured these stolen moments, the first real affection she had ever received from someone outside her immediate family. Edward's attention made her feel valued and special, as though her difficult circumstances were merely the prelude to a much grander story. But Edward Sullivan was 16 years old and the heir to considerable wealth and social position. Charlotte Murphy was 12 and the daughter of the town's most desperately poor family. In 1889 territorial Colorado, that gap represented an unbridgeable chasm that no amount of intelligence or affection could close, at least not for someone like Edward, who had never been forced to choose between personal happiness and social advantage. Charlotte's mother, Rose, began to notice changes in her daughter's behavior. The girl seemed distracted during their evening conversations, spending long periods staring out the window with a dreamy expression that suggested her thoughts were far from their drafty cabin. When Charlotte mentioned Edward Sullivan's kindness in lending her books, Rose felt a chill of apprehension that had nothing to do with the winter weather. "Charlotte," Rose said carefully, "I want you to be very cautious about accepting too much attention from young Mr. Sullivan. Men from his social position don't form serious attachments to girls from families like ours. What seems like kindness to you might be something very different to him." But Charlotte was 12 years old and desperately hungry for affection and validation. Edward's attention filled emotional needs that had been neglected throughout her difficult childhood, and his promises of a different future seemed to offer everything she had ever dreamed of achieving. When he told her that their love could overcome any obstacle, she believed him completely. The harsh realities of their situation became clear on a cold March evening when Charlotte realized she was carrying Edward's child. The discovery filled her with a complex mixture of fear, excitement, and hope. Surely now Edward would have to make good on his promises. Surely now he would find a way to marry her and take her away from the poverty and social isolation that had defined her entire life. She waited for the right moment to tell him, rehearsing the words and imagining his reaction. In her 12-year-old mind, the pregnancy represented not a crisis but an opportunity, the catalyst that would force their relationship into the open and compel the Sullivan family to accept her as Edward's rightful wife. She had read enough romantic novels to believe that true love could conquer social differences, that determination and virtue would ultimately triumph over prejudice and convention. When she finally gathered the courage to share her news during one of their secret meetings, Charlotte expected surprise, perhaps concern, but ultimately acceptance and commitment. Instead, she watched the color drain from Edward's face as her words sank in, followed by a long silence that seemed to stretch into eternity. "Are you certain?" he asked finally, his voice carrying a note of desperation that she had never heard before. "Yes," Charlotte replied, reaching for his hand. "But Edward, this means we can be together now. We can be married and start the life you've been describing. My pregnancy will force your parents to accept our relationship." Edward pulled his hand away, his expression shifting from shock to something approaching panic. "Charlotte, you don't understand. My parents will never accept this. They have plans for my future that don't include marriage to someone from your background. If they learn about this, they'll send me away to school back east and make sure I never return to Millbrook Creek." The rejection hit Charlotte like a physical blow. shattering the romantic dreams that had sustained her through months of secret meetings and whispered promises. But worse than the personal betrayal was the dawning realization that she had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of their relationship. What had seemed like love to her had been something much more casual and disposable to him. "But you said you loved me," Charlotte whispered, her voice breaking with the weight of her disillusionment. "You said we would build a life together." Edward's face hardened with the selfish desperation of someone who had never been forced to accept responsibility for his actions. "I never promised to marry you," he said coldly. "I said we could have a future together, but I didn't mean as husband and wife. Girls like you don't marry men like me, Charlotte. You should have understood that." The cruelty of his response revealed the true nature of their relationship with devastating clarity. Charlotte had been nothing more than an amusing diversion for a wealthy young man temporarily confined to a boring frontier town. Her intelligence and ambition, the very qualities that had made her believe she was special, had simply made her a more interesting conquest than the other available options. As the reality of her situation sank in, Charlotte understood that she faced choices that would determine not only her own future, but the life of her unborn child. In 1889, Millbrook Creek, an unmarried pregnant girl from a poor family, had virtually no options for survival, let alone prosperity. The community that had barely tolerated her exceptional abilities would show no mercy for what they would view as moral failure and social transgression. The girl who had once dreamed of using her intelligence to build a better life now faced the prospect of complete social exile, carrying a child whose father had already disavowed any responsibility for her welfare. But Charlotte Murphy possessed something that her circumstances could not destroy, a core of steel-hard determination that refused to accept defeat, even in the face of seemingly impossible odds. The weeks following Edward Sullivan's rejection were perhaps the most torturous of Charlotte Murphy's young life. She continued her work at Dr. Richardson's clinic, but the joy she had once found in learning and healing had been replaced by annoying desperation that made even simple tasks feel overwhelming. Every morning brought the reality of her condition closer to discovery, and every evening found her lying awake in the drafty cabin, trying to imagine a future that seemed increasingly impossible to achieve. Edward had made his position brutally clear during their final conversation. Not only would he not marry her, but he would deny any involvement if the pregnancy became public knowledge. He had even suggested that Charlotte's reputation for intelligence might work against her. Who would believe that such a supposedly smart girl would allow herself to be compromised unless she had been pursuing multiple relationships simultaneously? The cruelty of this logic was breathtaking. Edward was using Charlotte's greatest strength, her intellect, as a weapon against her credibility. In the small world of Millbrook Creek, where gossip traveled faster than wildfire, such accusations could destroy not only Charlotte's future but her mother's livelihood as well. Rose Murphy's laundry business depended on maintaining the respect of the town's more prosperous families, and any scandal involving her daughter would immediately cost them their primary source of income. Charlotte's attempts to reason with Edward grew more desperate as her condition became harder to conceal. She waited for him outside his father's bank, hoping to catch him in a moment when his conscience might overcome his self-preservation. She wrote letters that she never sent, pouring out her feelings and pleading for him to remember the promises he had made during their secret meetings. She even considered approaching Patrick Sullivan directly, though the impossibility of that course became clear the moment she imagined trying to explain her situation to the most powerful man in Millbrook Creek. The cruel irony was that Charlotte's pregnancy was beginning to affect her work at the clinic in ways that Dr. Richardson was starting to notice. Her morning sickness made it difficult to assist with procedures that involved strong odors, and her emotional turmoil was affecting her usual steady concentration. Dr. Richardson, being a physician, was beginning to recognize symptoms that Charlotte had hoped to keep hidden for several more weeks. The confrontation came on a rainy April morning when Charlotte's attempts to hide her nausea finally failed completely. She had been helping Dr. Richardson treat a minor injury when the sight and smell of blood suddenly overwhelmed her, forcing her to rush outside where she was violently sick behind the clinic building. When she returned, pale and shaking, Dr. Richardson's expression carried the grim understanding of someone who had delivered enough babies to recognize the signs of early pregnancy. "Charlotte," Dr. Richardson said gently, closing the clinic door to ensure their privacy, "I think we need to have a conversation about your current condition and what options might be available to you." The kindness in his voice nearly broke Charlotte's composure entirely. For weeks, she'd been carrying the burden of her situation alone, unable to confide in her mother for fear of the additional stress it would cause, and certainly unable to seek comfort from the young man who had created the problem. Dr. Richardson's gentle concern offered the first human compassion she had experienced since discovering her pregnancy. "I don't know what to do," Charlotte whispered, the words tumbling out with the relief of finally being able to speak honestly about her predicament. I believed that when he knew, he would do the right thing. But he's made it clear that he considers me entirely responsible for the situation." Dr. Richardson listened with the patient attention of someone who had witnessed enough human tragedy to understand the complexities of moral failure and social injustice. He asked no probing questions about the identity of the father, though. Charlotte suspected he had already drawn his own conclusions based on her recent behavior and the limited pool of young men who moved in circles that might have given them access to her. "Charlotte," Dr. Richardson said carefully, "I want you to understand that whatever decisions you make about this situation, you will have my support and assistance. But I also need you to understand the realities you're facing. An unmarried pregnancy in a community like Millbrook Creek carries consequences that extend far beyond the immediate challenges of childbirth and child-rearing." The doctor outlined these consequences with the clinical precision that made him such an effective physician. Charlotte would lose her position at the clinic immediately once her condition became public knowledge. Her mother's laundry business would likely collapse as prosperous families refused to associate with a family touched by scandal. The baby would be born bearing the stigma of illegitimacy, facing lifelong social and economic disadvantages in a society that punished children for circumstances beyond their control. But Dr. Richardson also presented Charlotte with information that offered a different kind of choice. There were procedures, he explained quietly, that could end the pregnancy before it progressed much further. Such procedures carried risks, certainly, but they were sometimes the most practical solution for young women facing impossible circumstances. He could arrange for Charlotte to travel to Denver, where such services were available discreetly and with proper medical supervision. The suggestion forced Charlotte to confront moral and practical considerations that no 12-year-old should have to face alone. The idea of ending her pregnancy offered an escape from the social catastrophe that threatened to destroy her family's survival. But it also represented the final abandonment of her dreams about marriage to Edward and the respectable future she had imagined building with him. Charlotte spent 3 sleepless nights weighing her options, walking the muddy streets of Millbrook Creek in the early morning hours before anyone else was awake. She passed the Sullivan family's grand house with its painted shutters and well-tended garden, imagining the comfortable life that Edward would continue to enjoy regardless of how her own story unfolded. She stood outside the church where she had attended services with her mother, wondering what Reverend Walsh would say if he knew about her condition and the impossible choices she faced. But it was a chance encounter with Margaret Sullivan that ultimately sealed Charlotte's fate and eliminated whatever options she might have had for keeping her situation private. Charlotte had been walking past the general store when Mrs. Sullivan emerged, her arms full of packages that spoke to the comfortable affluence of her daily life. The older woman's sharp eyes immediately focused on Charlotte with the predatory Attention of someone who specialized in detecting and exploiting social vulnerabilities. "Charlotte Murphy," Margaret Sullivan said, her voice carrying the false sweetness that barely concealed her genuine dislike. "You look rather pale lately. I do hope you're not coming down with something that might affect your work with Dr. Richardson. It would be such a shame if illness forced you to give up your unusual employment arrangements." The comment was innocuous enough on the surface, but Charlotte recognized the underlying threat. Margaret Sullivan had been one of the most vocal critics of Charlotte's medical training, and she was clearly watching for any opportunity to reinforce her arguments about the inappropriateness of allowing young girls to engage in such work. "I'm quite well, thank you, Mrs. Sullivan," Charlotte replied, trying to keep her voice steady despite the nausea that had been plaguing her for weeks. "Dr. Richardson has been very pleased with my assistance, and I believe the community benefits from having trained help available at the clinic." Margaret Sullivan's smile sharpened at this display of spirit from someone she considered far above her proper station. "Yes, well, I'm sure Dr. Richardson appreciates having help with his work. Though I must say, some of us in the community have concerns about young girls being exposed to delicate medical situations. It's important that our children maintain proper moral boundaries, don't you think?" The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Margaret Sullivan probing delicately for information while Charlotte struggled to maintain her composure. But the older woman's practiced eye had already detected the subtle changes in Charlotte's appearance that confirmed her growing suspicions. The slight pallor, the way Charlotte's dress fit differently around her waist, the barely concealed nausea that flickered across her features, all of these details painted a picture that Margaret Sullivan was eager to investigate further. Within hours of their encounter, Margaret Sullivan had shared her suspicions with her closest confidants in the ladies' auxiliary. The whispered conversation spread through Millbrook Creek's social networks with devastating efficiency, growing more detailed and damning with each retelling. By evening, half the town was buzzing with speculation about Charlotte Murphy's condition and the identity of the man responsible for her predicament. The speculation might have remained confined to gossip. Circles of Edward Sullivan hadn't panicked when he learned that his name was being mentioned in connection with Charlotte's situation. Instead of maintaining the dignified silence that might have allowed the rumors to die down naturally, Edward made the fatal mistake of actively denying his involvement in ways that only confirmed the community's suspicions. Edward's denials took the form of public comments about Charlotte's character and behavior that were designed to shift blame entirely onto her shoulders. He suggested to anyone who would listen that Charlotte had been pursuing relationships with multiple young men simultaneously, using her position at the clinic to meet traveling salesmen and railroad workers who passed through town. He even implied that her intelligence and education had made her arrogant and morally reckless, believing herself above the social conventions that governed other girls her age. These accusations were particularly devastating because they twisted Charlotte's greatest strengths into evidence of moral failure. Her intelligence became cunning manipulation. Her ambition became social climbing. Her determination to rise above her circumstances became evidence of dangerous pride that needed to be humbled through community action, the campaign of character. Assassination reached its climax when Edward publicly claimed that Charlotte had attempted to blackmail him into marriage by falsely claiming he was responsible for her pregnancy. According to his version of events, Charlotte had calculated that the Sullivan family's wealth and social position would make them vulnerable to such accusations, regardless of their truthfulness. "She's been reading too many romantic novels," Edward told a gathering of young men outside the barber shop, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone who had never faced serious consequences for his actions. She convinced herself that she could trap someone from a respectable family into marriage by manufacturing a scandal. It's pathetic, really. Did she honestly think anyone would believe that I would involve myself with someone from her background? The Public humiliation was more than Charlotte could bear. She had endured poverty, social isolation, and the collapse of her romantic dreams. But Edward's systematic destruction of her reputation represented a level of cruelty that she had never imagined possible. He was not content with simply abandoning her. He was determined to ensure that she would never be able to tell her side of the story, or seek any form of justice or support. The final blow came when Dr. Richardson was forced to terminate Charlotte's employment at the clinic. The physician had attempted to weather the storm of criticism, defending Charlotte's character and competence to anyone who would listen. But the pressure from the community's leading families became too intense to ignore, particularly when Patrick Sullivan made it clear that continued support for Charlotte would result in serious economic consequences for Dr. Richardson's practice. "I'm sorry, Charlotte," Dr. Richardson said privately when he delivered the news of her dismissal. "You're one of the most capable assistants I've ever had, and under different circumstances, I would fight to keep you regardless of community pressure. But they've made it impossible for me to continue employing you without destroying my ability to serve this community's medical needs." Charlotte understood the impossible position Dr. Richardson faced, but the loss of her employment eliminated her last source of income and social legitimacy. Without work, she would be unable to support herself during the pregnancy or after the baby's birth. More importantly, the public nature of her dismissal served as a final confirmation of the community's judgment about her character and worthiness. The social isolation that followed was swift and merciless. Families who had previously employed Rose Murphy for laundry services began canceling their arrangements, citing concerns about associating with a household touched by scandal. Shopkeepers who had once extended credit to the Murphy family suddenly demanded immediate payment for all purchases. Even Reverend Walsh, who prided himself on Christian compassion, made it clear that Charlotte's continued presence in church services was causing discomfort among other families. The economic pressure forced Rose Murphy into an impossible situation. She could continue supporting her daughter and face the complete collapse of their financial survival, or she could attempt to distance herself from Charlotte's scandal in hopes of salvaging what remained of their social and economic position. The choice was particularly cruel because Rose loved her daughter deeply and recognized that Charlotte's situation was the result of exploitation rather than moral failure. The final confrontation came on a cold evening in late April when Patrick Sullivan himself visited the Murphy cabin. The banker arrived with the kind of businesslike efficiency that had made him successful in territorial Colorado's competitive financial environment. But his purpose was not commercial. He came as the unofficial spokesman for Millbrook Creek's respectable society, empowered to deliver an ultimatum that would determine Charlotte's future. "Mrs. Murphy," Patrick Sullivan began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, "I think we need to discuss your daughter's situation and the effect it's having on our community's reputation and moral standards." Sullivan laid out the problem with the precision of a banker foreclosing on a defaulted loan. Charlotte's continued presence in Millbrook Creek was creating social disruption that extended far beyond her immediate family. The scandal was affecting the community's ability to attract new settlers and businesses, potentially damaging the economic growth that Sullivan and other leaders had worked years to achieve. The solution Sullivan proposed was both simple and devastating. Charlotte would leave Millbrook Creek immediately, never to return. In exchange, the Sullivan family would provide enough money for her to travel to a distant city where she could start over without the burden of local scandal. The arrangement would protect the community's reputation while giving Charlotte a chance to build a new life away from the consequences of her poor judgment. "And if she refuses to leave?" Rose Murphy asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sullivan's expression hardened with the implacable determination of someone who had never allowed sentiment to interfere with practical decision-making. "Then I'm afraid the consequences will Be severe for your entire family. No one in Millbrook Creek will do business with you. No one will employ you. You'll be left to survive entirely on your own resources, which I believe we both know are insufficient for long-term survival. The threat was delivered with businesslike efficiency, but its implications were crystal clear. Charlotte could leave voluntarily with enough money to start over elsewhere, or she could stay and watch her family slowly starve as the community systematically cut off all sources of support and income. Faced with this impossible choice, Charlotte made the decision that would define the rest of her life. She would leave Millbrook Creek, but not in defeat. She would use this exile as an opportunity to build something extraordinary, something that would eventually allow her to return with enough power to reshape the community, according to her own vision of justice and moral accountability. The frightened, powerless girl who had trusted Edward Sullivan's promises was about to die forever, replaced by someone harder, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous to the comfortable certainties that governed frontier society, the locomotive that carried Charlotte Murphy away from Millbrook Creek wheezed to a stop in the bustling railroad yards of Kansas City on a humid morning in May 1889. She stepped onto the platform carrying a single carpet bag containing everything she owned in the world, along with the envelope of money that Patrick Sullivan had provided to ensure her permanent departure. At 13 years old and 4 months pregnant, Charlotte had never been more than 20 miles from her birthplace, and the sprawling industrial city that surrounded her felt like stepping into an alien world. Kansas City in 1889 was a place where fortunes were made and lost daily, where immigrants from across Europe mixed with former slaves seeking opportunity, and where the social hierarchies of smaller communities gave way to the raw capitalism of a rapidly expanding nation. For someone fleeing scandal in a frontier town, it offered the precious gift of anonymity, the chance to reinvent oneself according to new rules and different possibilities. Charlotte's first priority was finding lodging that would accept a young woman traveling alone without asking uncomfortable questions about her circumstances. The boarding house district near the railroad yards catered to transients, seasonal workers, and others whose lives didn't fit conventional patterns. Mrs. Gertrude Hoffman, who operated a clean but modest establishment on Oak Street, had seen enough desperate young women to recognize someone genuinely trying to build a better life rather than simply escaping consequences. "I don't ask questions about what brought folks to my doorstep," Mrs. Hoffman told Charlotte as she showed her to a small room on the 3rd floor. "But I do expect honest work, decent behavior, and payment on time. You follow those rules, and you'll find this a safe place to figure out what comes next." The room was barely larger than a closet, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the railroad yards where trains arrived and departed at all hours. But it was private, relatively clean, and affordable with the money Charlotte had been given. More importantly, it represented the first space she had ever controlled entirely on her own terms. Charlotte's initial weeks in Kansas City were a brutal education in urban survival. The skills that had served her well in Millbrook Creek, her ability to read, write, and think critically, meant little when she needed to find work that would support her during pregnancy and after her child's birth. Most employment opportunities for women required references, experience, or social connections that she simply didn't possess. She tried everything from factory work to domestic service, but her obvious pregnancy made employers reluctant to hire her for positions requiring physical labor or long-term commitment. The few jobs she could obtain sorting mail for a few hours each day, helping in busy restaurants during peak times, provided barely enough income to cover her room and board, let alone save money for the future. It was during one of her lowest moments, when she had eaten nothing but bread and milk for 3 days to conserve money, that Charlotte encountered the person who would reshape her understanding of what was possible for someone in her circumstances. Helena Vanderbilt was a woman in her 40s who operated a successful millinery shop catering to Kansas City's emerging upper class. More importantly, she was someone who had built her business empire from nothing, using intelligence, determination, and a keen understanding of human psychology to create opportunities where none had existed before. Charlotte first noticed Mrs. Vanderbilt at the Kansas City Public Library, where she spent her free hours reading everything she could find about business, law, and finance. The older woman was researching fashion trends in European magazines, taking detailed notes about styles and techniques that might appeal to her wealthy clientele. Charlotte was impressed by the methodical way Mrs. Vanderbilt approached her research, treating fashion as a serious intellectual pursuit rather than mere feminine frivolity. Their conversation began when Charlotte offered assistance with translating some French fashion terms that Mrs. Vanderbilt was struggling to understand. Charlotte's education, limited though it had been, included basic French and German that Dr. Richardson had taught her for reading medical texts. Mrs. Vanderbilt was impressed not only by Charlotte's linguistic skills, but by her obvious intelligence and her serious approach to learning. "You have an interesting mind," Mrs. Vanderbilt observed as they walked together toward the business district. "Most young women your age are interested in fashion only as consumers. You seem to understand it as a business proposition." Charlotte seized the opening to share her admiration for Mrs. Vanderbilt's success in building an independent enterprise. She asked thoughtful questions about market analysis, customer relations, and the challenges of competing with established businesses. Mrs. Vanderbilt found herself engaged in the kind of serious business discussion she rarely experienced with other women, regardless of their age or education. The relationship that developed was part mentorship, part business partnership, and part surrogate family arrangement. Mrs. Vanderbilt offered Charlotte a position in her shop, initially helping with basic tasks like organizing inventory and maintaining customer records. But as Charlotte's capabilities became apparent, her responsibilities expanded to include more complex work involving design consultation, financial record keeping, and strategic planning for business expansion. Success in business requires 3 essential qualities, Mrs. Vanderbilt explained during one of their evening conversations in the comfortable apartment above the shop. Intelligence to understand what people want before they know it themselves, discipline to execute plans with perfect precision, and patience to build long-term advantage rather than seeking immediate gratification. Mrs. Vanderbilt had learned these principles through her own difficult journey from poverty to prosperity. Born into a German immigrant family with no social connections or financial resources, she had spent her teenage years working in textile factories before recognizing that creating luxury goods offered better profit margins than manufacturing basic commodities. She had taught herself design, developed relationships with wealthy customers, and gradually built a business that now served some of the most prominent families in Kansas City. Charlotte absorbed these lessons with the same intensity she had once brought to her medical studies. She learned to read customers' personalities and preferences, understanding that successful business relationships required psychological insight as much as technical skill. She studied the social dynamics of Kansas City's elite circles, noting how wealth was displayed, status was communicated, and influence was exercised through seemingly casual interactions. Most importantly, Mrs. Vanderbilt taught Charlotte that adversity could be transformed into advantage if approached with the right mindset. "People who have never struggled don't understand resilience," she explained. "They break easily when circumstances become difficult. But someone who has survived real hardship develops capabilities that can't be taught in schools or inherited." Through family connections, Charlotte's pregnancy progressed smoothly under Mrs. Vanderbilt's protective supervision. The older woman ensured that Charlotte received proper medical care, adequate nutrition, and emotional support during a time that could have been devastating for a young woman facing motherhood alone. When Charlotte's daughter was born in September 1889, Mrs. Vanderbilt served as both midwife and grandmother, helping to welcome the child into a world that was very different from the one Charlotte had known in Millbrook Creek. The baby was healthy, beautiful, and possessed the same intelligent eyes that had distinguished her mother from earliest childhood. Charlotte named her Victoria, choosing a name that suggested strength, dignity, and the kind of success that transcended circumstances of birth. From the beginning, Charlotte was determined that her daughter would grow up understanding that she was capable of achieving anything she chose to pursue. Mrs. Vanderbilt's support during this period went beyond mere kindness. It represented a strategic investment in Charlotte's long-term potential. The older woman recognized that Charlotte possessed rare qualities: exceptional intelligence, fierce determination, and the kind of moral clarity that could only come from experiencing injustice firsthand. These qualities, properly developed, could create opportunities that would benefit both Charlotte and anyone wise enough to ally themselves with her future success. As Victoria grew from infant to toddler, Charlotte's role in the millinery business expanded significantly. She developed an intuitive understanding of what wealthy women wanted from their clothing and accessories, not just in terms of fashion but in terms of social communication. A hat wasn't merely a decorative item. It was a statement about the wearer's taste, sophistication, and economic status. Charlotte learned to create designs that would make customers feel more elegant, more confident, and more socially powerful. But Charlotte's real education was happening in the evenings, when she and Mrs. Vanderbilt would analyze the day's business transactions and discuss broader strategies for growth and expansion. Charlotte learned about profit margins, inventory management, and customer retention. She studied the principles of marketing, understanding how to create demand for luxury goods among people who already possessed more than they needed. More importantly, Charlotte began to understand how money really worked, not just the earning of it, but its multiplication through careful investment and strategic partnerships. Mrs. Vanderbilt introduced her to the basics of stock investment, real estate speculation, and business financing. Charlotte learned that wealth wasn't just accumulated through hard work. It was created through intelligence, timing, and the ability to recognize opportunities that others missed. When Victoria was 2 years old, Charlotte made her first independent business decision. She had saved enough money to purchase a small building near the shopping district, using it to establish her own business complementing Mrs. Vanderbilt's high-end millinery shop. Charlotte's enterprise focused on providing fashionable, ready-to-wear clothing for working women who aspired to elegance but couldn't afford custom-made garments. The business model was innovative for its time. Charlotte recognized that Kansas City's growing population of female office workers, teachers, and shop girls wanted clothing that would help them appear successful and sophisticated. But they needed garments that were practical, affordable, and immediately available. She created a line of dresses, blouses, and accessories that offered style and quality at prices that working women could afford. The venture succeeded beyond even Charlotte's optimistic projections. Within 6 months, she was employing 4 seamstresses and considering expansion to additional locations. The success wasn't just financial. It represented Charlotte's growing understanding of how to identify market opportunities and execute business plans with precision and efficiency. But Charlotte's most important education was happening through her careful observation of Kansas City's social and political structures. She attended public lectures, political rallies, and cultural events, studying how influence was exercised and power was accumulated in an urban environment. She learned to recognize the difference between inherited wealth and earned success, between superficial status and genuine capability. Charlotte also began developing the network of relationships that would eventually support her return to Millbrook Creek. She cultivated friendships with lawyers, doctors, journalists, and business leaders who respected her intelligence and appreciated her practical approach to solving problems. These relationships weren't just social. They represented potential allies in the campaign of justice she was already planning. When Victoria turned 3, Charlotte enrolled her in Kansas City's finest private school, determined that her daughter would receive the education and social training that circumstances had denied to Charlotte herself. But Charlotte also began Victoria's informal education in the realities of power, influence, and social justice. She told her daughter stories about communities that failed to protect their most vulnerable members, about the importance of using strength to defend rather than exploit others. "Remember, my darling," Charlotte would tell Victoria during their evening conversations, "we have advantages now that many people lack, but advantages create responsibilities. We must use our strength to ensure that other people are not treated the way we treated when we had no power to defend ourselves." By the time Victoria was 4 years old, Charlotte had built a small business empire that generated substantial profits and provided employment for dozens of women. She owned 3 buildings in Kansas City's commercial district, maintained investment portfolios in railroad and mining stocks, and had established relationships with suppliers and customers throughout the Midwest. More importantly, she had transformed herself from a frightened, powerless girl into a woman, capable of competing successfully in the masculine world of business and finance. But throughout this period of growth and success, Charlotte never forgot the injustices that had driven her from Millbrook Creek. She kept detailed records of Edward Sullivan's character assassination, Patrick Sullivan's economic threats, and the community's systematic persecution of her family. She tracked news from Millbrook Creek through newspaper correspondence and business connections, learning about the town's continued development and the ongoing success of the families who had destroyed her childhood. The information she gathered painted a picture of a community that had prospered while forgetting entirely about the young woman they had driven away in shame. Edward Sullivan had married a wealthy rancher's daughter and was being groomed to take over his father's banking empire. Patrick Sullivan had expanded his financial operations throughout the territory. Margaret Sullivan continued to dominate the town's social hierarchy, organizing charity events and cultural activities that reinforced her position as the arbiter of moral respectability. As Charlotte's resources and capabilities grew, so did her determination to return to Millbrook Creek and demand accountability for what they had done to her. But this would not be the desperate return of a victim seeking sympathy or assistance. It would be the calculated campaign of a woman who had built the power necessary to reshape an entire community according to her own vision of justice. Charlotte Murphy, the frightened girl who had been driven from Millbrook Creek in shame, was gone forever. In her place stood someone infinitely more dangerous to the comfortable assumptions that governed frontier society, a woman who understood exactly how power worked and had accumulated enough of it to threaten everything the Sullivan family had built their reputation upon. 15 years after her exile, Victoria Blackwood spent her second morning in Millbrook Creek, conducting what appeared to be casual business inquiries, but was actually a comprehensive intelligence-gathering operation. Armed with detailed financial records, legal documents, and a network of professional contacts that extended across 3 states, she was methodically cataloging every weakness in the community's economic and social structure. Her first stop was the county courthouse, where public records revealed the intricate web of business relationships, property ownership, and debt obligations that connected Millbrook Creek's leading families. Victoria studied mortgage documents, tax assessments, and business incorporation papers with the practiced eye of someone who understood that information was the most valuable currency in any conflict. What she discovered was both useful and deeply satisfying. The Sullivan family's banking empire, while outwardly prosperous, was significantly more vulnerable than their confident public demeanor suggested. Patrick Sullivan had overextended his lending operations during the territorial expansion boom, making risky loans to cattle ranchers and mining operations that were now struggling to meet their obligations. The bank's capital reserves were lower, than prudent banking practices would recommend, leaving them exposed to any sudden downturn in the regional economy. More intriguingly, Edward Sullivan's personal finances revealed a pattern of poor judgment and reckless spending that suggested he had inherited his father's position without developing the discipline necessary to manage it responsibly. He had borrowed heavily against his future inheritance to finance investments in mining stocks that had performed poorly, and his lifestyle expenses consistently exceeded his legitimate income from the bank. Victoria made careful notes about these discoveries, understanding that financial pressure could be a powerful tool for compelling cooperation from people who might otherwise resist her demands for accountability. But she was also gathering information about the community's social dynamics, studying how power was distributed and exercised among Millbrook Creek's elite families. The town had indeed grown substantially during her absence, expanding from a frontier settlement of fewer than 500 residents to a prosperous community of nearly 2,000 people. The railroad connection that had been discussed during Victoria's childhood had finally been completed, bringing regular commerce and communication with larger cities. New businesses lined Main Street, and several imposing houses on the hillside testified to the wealth that successful families had accumulated. But growth had also created new fault lines in the community's social structure. The established families who had dominated Millbrook Creek during Victoria's childhood now competed for influence with newcomers who brought different perspectives and business practices. These tensions offered opportunities for someone skilled in exploiting divisions among potential adversaries. Victoria's next priority was establishing her credentials as a serious business investor whose presence would benefit the entire community. She arranged a meeting with Mayor Franklin Pierce, a newcomer who had been elected 3 years earlier on a platform of progressive development and modernization. Pierce was exactly the kind of ally Victoria needed, someone with political authority but without personal connections to the family she intended to confront. "Mrs. Blackwood," Mayor Pierce said as he welcomed her into his office, "I understand you're considering significant investments in our community. We're always eager to work with serious business people who recognize Millbrook Creek's potential for continued growth." Victoria had prepared for this conversation with the same methodical attention she brought to all her business negotiations. She presented detailed proposals for 3 major development projects that would transform Millbrook Creek's economic prospects while positioning her as an indispensable partner in the community's future success. The first project involved establishing a regional textile manufacturing facility that would employ over 200 workers and produce high-quality fabrics for distribution throughout the Western Territories. Victoria had already negotiated preliminary agreements with suppliers and distributors, and she possessed the capital necessary to fund the entire operation. The facility would bring unprecedented industrial employment to Millbrook Creek while generating substantial tax revenue for municipal improvements. The second proposal focused on developing a modern hospital and medical training center that would serve patients throughout the region. Victoria had cultivated relationships with several prominent physicians who were interested in establishing practices in smaller communities, provided they could access proper facilities and equipment. The medical center would enhance Millbrook Creek's reputation while providing essential services that could attract additional settlers and businesses. The third project was perhaps the most ambitious, a comprehensive plan for expanding and modernizing the town's infrastructure, including improved roads, expanded rail connections, and modern utilities. Victoria had formed partnerships with engineering firms and construction companies that could execute these improvements efficiently and cost-effectively. The infrastructure upgrades would support all other economic development, while demonstrating Millbrook Creek's commitment to long-term growth. Mayor Pierce listened to these proposals with growing excitement, recognizing their potential to transform his community from a regional trading center into a significant economic hub. The scale of Victoria's vision far exceeded anything the local business community had imagined. and her obvious capability to finance and execute such projects made her an invaluable potential partner. "These are remarkable proposals, Mrs. Blackwood," Mayor Pierce said as he reviewed the detailed documentation Victoria had provided. "The economic impact would be transformational for our entire region. I assume you've considered the challenges of implementing such ambitious projects in a community our size?" Victoria smiled with the confidence of someone who had spent years preparing for exactly this conversation. "Mayor Pierce, I've built successful enterprises in cities much larger than Millbrook Creek, and I've learned that smaller communities often offer advantages that urban environments lack. There's less bureaucratic interference, more direct relationships between business leaders and political authorities, and greater flexibility in adapting projects to local conditions." She also explained her personal connection to the region, carefully crafted to suggest deep roots without revealing her true identity. According to the story Victoria had prepared, she had spent her childhood in a neighboring county before moving east for education and business opportunities. Her return represented both professional opportunity and personal satisfaction in contributing to the development of familiar territory. The meeting concluded with Mayor Pierce's enthusiastic endorsement of Victoria's development plans and his promise to facilitate whatever permissions and cooperation she might need from municipal authorities. Victoria had successfully positioned herself as an essential partner in Millbrook Creek's future, making opposition to her presence equivalent to opposition to the community's economic prosperity. But Victoria's most crucial conversations were happening in less formal settings, where she could observe the personal dynamics that would determine how her eventual revelation would be received. She attended church services at the Methodist Church where Reverend Timothy Walsh delivered sermons about moral responsibility and community obligation. She participated in social gatherings at the hotel where the town's elite families discussed local politics and business opportunities. Each interaction was carefully calculated to demonstrate her sophistication, generosity, and commitment to Millbrook Creek's welfare, while gradually introducing doubts about the moral foundations of the community's current leadership. Victoria donated generously to church improvement projects, sponsored educational initiatives at the school, and provided employment opportunities for local workers through her preliminary project planning. More subtly, she began asking questions that forced community leaders to defend positions and decisions they had never been required to justify publicly. During a discussion about educational policy, Victoria wondered aloud why Millbrook Creek had never established programs to support gifted students from disadvantaged backgrounds. At a church social, she inquired about the community's efforts to assist families facing economic hardship. These questions were delivered with perfect politeness and apparent innocence, but they created psychological pressure on people who had built their reputations on claims of moral leadership. Victoria was forcing them to articulate values and principles that they might find difficult to reconcile with their past actions. Her most significant early success came through her relationship with Dr. Samuel Richardson, who had aged considerably during her absence but continued to serve as Millbrook Creek's primary physician. Dr. Richardson had always possessed a stronger moral compass than most of the community's leaders, and his memory of Charlotte Murphy remained painful even after 15 years. Victoria approached Dr. Richardson through her medical center proposal, presenting herself as someone genuinely committed to improving healthcare access for underserved populations. Their conversations about medical ethics and community responsibility created opportunities for Victoria to probe his recollections of past injustices without revealing her personal connection to those events. "I've often wondered," Victoria mentioned during one of their discussions about the proposed medical center, "whether small communities like Millbrook Creek have always been successful in protecting their most vulnerable residents. In my experience, isolated communities sometimes develop blind spots about their own moral responsibilities." Dr. Richardson's expression grew thoughtful at this observation, I'm afraid you're correct about that tendency, Mrs. Blackwood. There have been occasions in our community's history when fear of scandal or concern about reputation led to decisions that I now recognize as morally questionable. Young people, particularly young women, sometimes suffered consequences that were disproportionate to their alleged transgressions. The conversation continued carefully, with Victoria drawing out Dr. Richardson's memories and regrets without forcing him to confront the full implications of what he was revealing. But she could see that he remembered Charlotte, Murphy's situation, and continued to feel guilt about his inability to protect her from the community's persecution. These conversations served multiple purposes for Victoria's long-term strategy. They confirmed that at least some community members retained conscience about past injustices, providing potential allies when she eventually demanded accountability. They also established her credentials as someone genuinely concerned about moral responsibility and social justice, making her eventual accusations more credible. Victoria's most challenging interactions were with the Sullivan family members, who remained the primary targets of her justice campaign. Patrick Sullivan had aged into the role of community patriarch, wielding influence that extended far beyond his banking operations. His wife Margaret continued to dominate social circles through her leadership of charitable organizations and cultural activities. Edward Sullivan had indeed married into wealth and position, taking over day-to-day management of the bank while his father focused on broader community leadership. Edward's wife, Caroline, was a pleasant woman from a prominent ranching family who appeared genuinely devoted to her husband and their 3 children. Victoria observed their interactions with the detached interest of a scientist studying specimens. Noting how Edward had grown comfortable in his role as a respected community leader, Victoria's first direct conversation with Patrick Sullivan occurred at a community meeting about the proposed textile manufacturing facility. The banker's initial enthusiasm for her development projects was tempered by subtle wariness, as though some instinct warned him that Victoria Blackwood represented a potential threat to his carefully constructed empire. Mrs. Blackwood, Patrick Sullivan said as they discussed financing arrangements for the textile facility, "Your proposals are certainly ambitious, and your financial resources appear substantial. But I hope you understand that our community values stability and continuity. In our business relationships, we prefer to work with partners who share our long-term commitment to Millbrook Creek's traditional values." The comment was delivered with diplomatic politeness, but Victoria recognized the underlying message. Patrick Sullivan was asserting his authority over community affairs while suggesting that Victoria's acceptance would depend on her willingness to respect existing power structures. He was also probing for information about her background and motivations, trying to determine whether she represented a genuine business opportunity or a potential challenge to his influence. Victoria responded with equal diplomacy, emphasizing her respect for community traditions while subtly asserting her own authority and independence. "Mr. Sullivan, I appreciate your concern for maintaining continuity in business relationships. In my experience, the most successful communities are those that balance respect for proven traditions with openness to new ideas and opportunities. I'm confident that my projects will complement rather than compete with existing enterprises." The exchange established the parameters of what would eventually become a much more confrontational relationship. Both Victoria and Patrick Sullivan understood that they were engaging in preliminary maneuvering for a conflict whose true nature remained hidden beneath layers of business courtesy and community diplomacy. Victoria's relationship with Edward Sullivan was even more complex, as she had to manage her personal emotions while maintaining the strategic focus necessary for her long-term plans. Edward had grown heavier and more complacent during the years since their last encounter, his youthful arrogance replaced by the entitled confidence of someone who had never faced serious consequences for his actions. Their first conversation occurred at a social gathering where Edward was holding forth about the challenges of managing a modern banking operation in a frontier community. Victoria listened with apparent interest as he described his business philosophy and his vision for Millbrook Creek's economic development, noting how completely he had forgotten or rationalized away his treatment of Charlotte Murphy. Banking, in a community like ours, requires more than financial expertise, Edward explained to the gathered group. We must also serve as moral guardians, ensuring that our lending practices support families and businesses that reflect our community's values. It's a responsibility that I take very seriously. Victoria smiled politely at this display of self-righteousness, filing away Edward's words for future use when she revealed the contrast between his public persona and his private actions. But she also recognized something useful in his obvious pride and complacency. Edward Sullivan believed himself untouchable, protected by his social position and community standing. This overconfidence would make him more vulnerable when Victoria finally revealed her true identity and intentions. As her second week in Millbrook Creek drew to a close, Victoria had successfully established herself as an essential partner in the community's economic future while gathering comprehensive intelligence about her target's vulnerabilities and weaknesses. She had identified potential allies among community members who retained some conscience about past injustices, and she had begun the psychological preparation that would make her eventual revelations more devastating. Most importantly, Victoria had transformed herself from an outsider seeking acceptance into an insider, whose cooperation was essential for the community's continued prosperity. When she finally demanded accountability for the injustices committed against Charlotte Murphy, her targets would face a choice between accepting her terms or destroying their own economic futures. The stage was set for the confrontation that would determine whether justice delayed could finally become justice delivered. The moment Victoria Blackwood had been preparing for during 15 years of exile arrived on a warm September evening when Millbrook Creek's leading citizens gathered for the dedication ceremony of the community's new public library. Victoria had donated the funds for the building as part of her campaign to establish herself as an indispensable benefactor. But tonight the library would serve a very different purpose, as the stage for revelations that would forever change how the community understood power, justice, and moral accountability. The library's main hall was filled with everyone who mattered in Millbrook Creek society. Mayor Franklin Pierce presided over the ceremony with obvious pride in his community's cultural advancement. Patrick Sullivan sat in the front row with his wife Margaret, both of them basking in the recognition that came from associating with such a generous benefactor. Edward Sullivan and his wife Carolyn occupied prominent seats near the podium, their 3 children fidgeting in their formal clothes as they waited for the speeches to conclude. Dr. Samuel Richardson attended with his wife, though Victoria noticed the physician's expression carried subtle tension that suggested he sensed something significant was about to occur. Several newcomer families who had moved to Millbrook Creek during its recent expansion filled the remaining seats, all of them eager to participate in an event that demonstrated their community's growing sophistication and prosperity. Victoria had planned every detail of this evening with the same methodical precision she brought to her business operations. She wore a burgundy silk dress that cost more than most families in Millbrook Creek earned in 6 months, but its elegance was calculated to project authority rather than mere wealth. Her jewelry was substantial but tasteful, suggesting someone accustomed to moving in circles where true power was exercised quietly rather than ostentatiously. When Mayor Pierce introduced her as the evening's keynote speaker, Victoria rose to approach the podium with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable addressing rooms full of influential people. The applause that greeted her was warm and enthusiastic, reflecting the community's genuine gratitude for her financial generosity and their excitement about the economic opportunities her development projects would create. "My friends," Victoria began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed hall, "I want to thank you for the warmth with which you've welcomed me to Millbrook Creek. This community has always held a special place in my heart, though I suspect many of you don't yet understand the true nature of my connection to this place. The opening words contained subtle hints that this would not be a conventional dedication speech, but the audience remained focused on the speaker with polite attention. Victoria had established such strong credentials as a community benefactor that few people suspected her remarks might take an unexpected direction. When I decided to make substantial investments in Millbrook Creek's future, Victoria continued, I was motivated by more than business opportunity or economic potential. I was driven by a deep belief that communities must be held accountable for their moral choices, that prosperity built on foundations of injustice will ultimately collapse, and that those who abuse their power will eventually face consequences for their actions. The tone of her speech was beginning to make some audience members uncomfortable, though they couldn't yet identify the source of their unease. Victoria's words carried implications that seemed disconnected from the celebration they had expected to hear. Several people glanced at each other with puzzled expressions, wondering where this line of thinking might lead. Patrick Sullivan's expression had grown notably tense as he recognized something familiar yet impossible in Victoria's bearing and voice. His banker's instincts for detecting potential threats were screaming warnings, though he couldn't quite identify the specific danger he sensed. Beside him, Margaret Sullivan was studying Victoria with the sharp attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle that seemed to hover just beyond conscious recognition. 15 years ago, Victoria said, her voice taking on a harder edge that cut through the hall's comfortable atmosphere, this community faced a test of its moral character. A young woman, a girl, really found herself in desperate circumstances that required compassion, support, and protection from those who claimed to lead this community according to Christian principles and civilized values. Dr. Richardson's face had gone pale as he began to understand where Victoria's speech was heading. His memories of Charlotte Murphy's situation came flooding back with painful clarity, and he found himself gripping his wife's hand as he anticipated what might be revealed. Instead of protection, Victoria continued relentlessly, that young woman received persecution. Instead of compassion, she faced systematic character assassination. Instead of justice, she was offered exile and silence. A 13-year-old girl was driven from her home to protect the reputation of the man who had impregnated her, and the community leaders who chose convenience over moral responsibility. The revelation hit the audience like a thunderclap. Gasps echoed through the hall as people began to remember details they had tried to forget about. Charlotte Murphy's situation 15 years earlier. The newcomers to Millbrook Creek looked confused, but the established families understood immediately that they were witnessing something unprecedented, direct challenge to the community's carefully constructed version of its own moral history. Edward Sullivan had gone completely white as recognition finally dawned. The voice, the bearing, the particular shade of amber eyes that had haunted his guilty dreams for 15 years, all of these elements suddenly coalesced into an impossible but undeniable truth. Charlotte Murphy had returned to Millbrook Creek, transformed beyond recognition but carrying the same fierce intelligence that had made her both attractive and dangerous as a child. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria said, her voice now carrying the full authority of someone who had spent 15 years building the power necessary for this moment. "I stand before you tonight as that 13-year-old girl, grown into a woman, with the resources and determination to demand the accountability that was denied to her so many years ago." The silence that followed was broken only by Margaret Sullivan's sharp intake of breath as she finally placed the familiar features that had been teasing at her memory since Victoria's arrival. The elegant woman who had donated thousands of dollars to community improvements, who had proposed development projects worth hundreds of thousands more, was the same desperate child they had driven away in shame to protect their social order. "My name was Charlotte Murphy," Victoria continued, "and I was systematically destroyed by this community to protect Edward Sullivan's reputation and his family's social standing. Tonight, I'm here to collect the debt that has been accumulating. Interest for 15 years. She reached into her evening bag and withdrew a leather portfolio that contained documents, photographs, and sworn statements that she had been collecting since her return to Millbrook Creek. The evidence represented not just her personal testimony, but corroboration from witnesses, medical records, and financial documentation that would make denial impossible. Edward Sullivan seduced a 13-year-old girl with promises of marriage and a better life, Victoria announced, her voice cutting through the stunned silence like a blade. When she became pregnant with his child, he abandoned her and launched a campaign of character assassination designed to destroy her credibility and shift all blame onto her shoulders. Edward remained frozen in his seat, unable to speak or move as his worst nightmares materialized before the entire community. His wife Carolyn was staring at him with growing horror as the implications of Victoria's accusations became clear. Their children, too young to fully understand what was happening, sensed the adult's distress and began to cry softly. Patrick Sullivan, as the community's leading citizen, orchestrated my exile to protect his family's reputation, Victoria continued. He used economic threats to force my mother's cooperation and ensure that I would disappear quietly without challenging their version of events. Margaret Sullivan led the social persecution that made my continued presence in Millbrook Creek impossible. The accusations were delivered with devastating precision, each one supported by specific details that made denial futile. Victoria had spent weeks gathering additional evidence during her return, interviewing witnesses who remembered the events and documenting the systematic nature of the community's response to her pregnancy. "The child I carried," Victoria said, her voice softening slightly as she spoke of her daughter, "grew up knowing exactly who her father was and exactly what kind of man he proved himself to be. Victoria Blackwood, my daughter, is now attending university in Chicago, where she's studying law with the intention of ensuring that what happened to me never happens to another young woman." The revelation that Victoria had named her daughter after herself, creating a living reminder of the identity she had been forced to abandon, added another layer of complexity to the emotional impact of her testimony. The elegant woman who had seemed like a fairy tale benefactor was revealed as someone who had built her entire adult life around the goal of returning to demand justice. Dr. Richardson found his voice first, rising from his seat with visible effort. "Charlotte," he said, his voice carrying years of suppressed guilt and regret, "I want you to know that I never stopped feeling ashamed of my failure to protect you. You were the most capable assistant I ever had, and you deserved better from all of us." The physician's acknowledgement seemed to break the spell that had held the audience in stunned silence. Other voices began to emerge, some expressing shock, others asking questions, and a few attempting to defend the community's past actions. But Victoria's commanding presence and the overwhelming evidence she had presented made it impossible to dismiss her accusations as the fantasies of a disturbed mind. "Dr. Richardson," Victoria replied with genuine warmth, "you were the only person in this community who treated me with consistent respect and dignity. I have never forgotten your kindness, and it's one of the reasons I chose to pursue this confrontation through economic pressure rather than simple destruction." She turned her attention back to the Sullivan family, her expression hardening as she faced the people who had shaped her understanding of how power could be abused. "Edward, Patrick, Margaret, you have spent 15 years enjoying prosperity and social respect while the girl you destroyed built herself into someone capable of threatening everything you've created." Patrick Sullivan finally found his voice, though it carried none of his usual authority. "What do you want from us?" he asked, his words barely audible in the tense silence of the hall. Victoria smiled, but it was not an expression of warmth or forgiveness. "I want public acknowledgement of what you did to me. I want financial compensation for the life that was stolen from me and the child who grew up without her father's support." And I want structural changes in this community that will ensure such injustices never happen again. She outlined her demands with the same methodical precision she had brought to her business proposals. Edward would publicly confess his role in her persecution and resign from all positions of authority in the community. Patrick Sullivan would transfer ownership of significant bank holdings to a trust fund that would support educational opportunities for disadvantaged young women. Margaret Sullivan would step down from her leadership roles in charitable organizations that would be restructured to serve the community's most vulnerable residents. And if we refuse? Patrick Sullivan asked, though his tone suggested he already understood the futility of resistance. Then I will use every resource at my disposal to destroy not just your family's reputation, but the economic foundations of this entire community, Victoria replied without hesitation. The development projects I've proposed can be relocated to neighboring towns that demonstrate greater commitment to justice and moral accountability. The businesses I've planned to establish can find more welcoming environments in communities that respect the principles I value. The threat was not idle, and everyone in the hall understood its implications. Victoria's proposed investments represented the largest economic opportunity in Millbrook Creek's history. Losing those projects would not only prevent future growth, but would signal to other potential investors that the community was hostile to outside development. The economic consequences would affect every family in town, not just the Sullivan family. Caroline Sullivan spoke for the first time since Victoria's revelations began, her voice trembling with shock and betrayal. "Edward," she said, turning to face her husband, "is this true? Did you really do these things to a 13-year-old girl?" Edward's silence was answer enough. The man who had built his adult identity around claims of moral leadership and community service was revealed as someone who had launched his successful career by destroying a child's life to protect his own convenience. "I was 18 years old," Edward finally whispered, as though his youth could somehow excuse the magnitude of his betrayal. "I made mistakes." Victoria's laugh was cold and sharp. "Mistakes are accidental, Edward. What you did to me was calculated, deliberate, and designed to ensure that I could never challenge your version of events. You didn't make mistakes, you made choices that revealed your true character." The confrontation continued for nearly an hour, with Victoria systematically dismantling every defense and rationalization that the Sullivan family attempted to offer. She had spent 15 years preparing for this moment, and she was not about to allow them to escape accountability through weak excuses or appeals to the passage of time. When the evening finally concluded, the Sullivan family had agreed to all of Victoria's demands rather than face the complete destruction of their social and economic position. Edward would make a public confession and resign from the bank. Patrick would transfer substantial assets to the Educational Trust Fund. Margaret would restructure the charitable organizations to focus on protecting rather than judging the community's most vulnerable residents. But perhaps most importantly, Millbrook Creek would be forced to confront the reality that its prosperity had been built partly on the systematic persecution of an innocent child. The community that had prided itself on moral leadership and Christian values would have to acknowledge that it held its most basic test of character. As the stunned audience filed out of the library, Victoria remained at the podium, savoring the completion of a justice campaign that had consumed 15 years of her life. The frightened, powerless girl who had been Charlotte Murphy was finally at peace. In her place stood a woman who had proven that those who abuse their power will eventually face consequences, no matter how long it takes or how completely they believe themselves protected by social position and community complicity. Justice delayed had finally become justice delivered. And Millbrook Creek would never be the same. 5 years after the night that transformed Millbrook Creek forever, the community bore little resemblance to the insular frontier settlement that had once driven a pregnant child into exile. The changes went far deeper than the impressive new buildings that lined Main Street. or the modern infrastructure that connected the town to regional commerce networks. The fundamental character of the community had been rebuilt according to principles of justice, accountability, and genuine moral leadership that Victoria Blackwood had imposed through her systematic use of economic power and social influence. The Murphy Educational Foundation, established with funds from Patrick Sullivan's forced asset transfers, had become one of the most prestigious scholarship programs in the Western Territories. Young women from disadvantaged backgrounds throughout Colorado competed for fellowships that provided not just financial support for university education, but comprehensive mentoring in leadership skills, professional development, and social responsibility. The foundation's motto, carved in marble above the entrance to its headquarters building, reads simply, "Intelligence unbound by circumstance." Victoria stood in the foundation's main conference room, reviewing applications from the latest group of scholarship candidates with her daughter, who had returned from Chicago with a law degree and an appointment as the foundation's executive director. At 21, Victoria Blackwood the younger possessed her mother's sharp intelligence and strategic thinking, but also an idealistic passion for social reform that had been shaped by growing up with the knowledge that her existence represented triumph over injustice. "Mother," young Victoria said as she studied a particularly compelling application from a 15-year-old girl whose family had lost their farm to drought, "I sometimes wonder if we're being too selective with these scholarships. There are so many deserving candidates, and we have the resources to help more of them." Victoria Blackwood smiled at her daughter's comment, recognizing the generous impulse while also understanding the strategic importance of maintaining high standards for their programs. "Remember, darling, that our goal isn't just to help individual young women, though that's certainly important. We're demonstrating to communities throughout the region that investing in exceptional minds produces extraordinary results, regardless of social background or economic circumstances." The conversation reflected the broader transformation that Victoria had orchestrated in Millbrook Creek's approach to education and social development. The community's schools now offered advanced programs that rivaled those available in major cities, attracting families who wanted their children to receive superior education without leaving the region. Teachers recruited from the finest universities competed for positions that offered not just excellent salaries, but the opportunity to work with students who were encouraged to think critically about complex social and moral issues. Dr. Samuel Richardson, now in his 70s but still practicing medicine, served as chairman of the medical center's board of directors. The facility that Victoria had proposed during her first weeks back in Millbrook Creek had grown into a regional hospital that provided advanced healthcare services throughout the territory while training the next generation of physicians according to the highest ethical standards. "The medical center's success has exceeded even my most optimistic projections," Dr. Richardson reported during their monthly board meeting. "We're treating patients from 5 counties at our surgical facilities, are attracting specialists who previously only practiced in Denver or San Francisco. More importantly, our training programs are producing physicians who understand that medical practice involves moral as well as technical responsibilities." The hospital's women's health services had become particularly renowned for their compassionate and comprehensive approach to reproductive health care. Young women facing difficult pregnancies received medical support, counseling, and practical assistance that ensured they had genuine choices about their futures. The contrast with how such situations had been handled during Charlotte Murphy's youth was both intentional and profound. Victoria's textile manufacturing facility had also exceeded all economic projections, employing over 400 workers and producing high-quality fabrics that were sold throughout the western United States. But the factory's true innovation lay in its labor practices, which provided unprecedented benefits for working families. Employees received healthcare coverage, educational opportunities for their children, and profit-sharing arrangements that made them genuine partners in the enterprise's success. The facilities manager, Maria Santos, had been recruited from a progressive company in Massachusetts and brought advanced ideas about industrial organization and worker welfare. Mrs. Blackwood's approach to business management is revolutionary. Maria explained to a group of visiting industrialists who had come to study the factory's operations. She understands that treating workers with dignity and providing them with opportunities for advancement creates productivity levels that exceed what can be achieved through traditional exploitation models. But perhaps the most significant change in Millbrook Creek was the transformation of its political and social leadership structure. The community's old elite families had either adapted to the new standards of accountability that Victoria had established or found themselves marginalized from positions of influence. Mayor Franklin Pierce had been re-elected twice on platforms that emphasized transparency, social justice, and economic policies that benefited the entire community rather than just established interests. Edward Sullivan had indeed resigned from the bank and all other positions of authority, as Victoria had demanded. His public confession of his treatment of Charlotte Murphy had been delivered at a community meeting that drew residents from throughout the county, many of whom came simply to witness such an unprecedented acknowledgement of moral failure by someone from a prominent family. The confession had been detailed, honest, and accompanied by genuine remorse that went far beyond the simple desire to minimize consequences. I want the community to understand that what I did to Charlotte Murphy when she was 13 years old was not a youthful mistake or an unfortunate misunderstanding, Edward had said, his voice carrying the weight of years of suppressed guilt. It was a deliberate betrayal of someone who trusted me, followed by a systematic campaign to destroy her reputation and credibility. I used my family's social position to escape accountability while she suffered consequences that should have been mine to bear. The aftermath of Edward's confession had been complex and painful for his immediate family. Carolyn Sullivan had initially considered divorce, struggling to reconcile the man she had married with the person revealed in Victoria's accusations. But she had ultimately chosen to work toward rebuilding their relationship on a foundation of honesty and genuine accountability. Their marriage had survived, though it had been fundamentally changed by the knowledge of Edward's past actions. Edward is not the same person who committed those crimes 20 years ago, Caroline had told Victoria during a private conversation several months after the public revelation. But I also understand that growth and change don't erase the harm that was done or eliminate the obligation to make amends. We're trying to rebuild our lives in ways that honor both accountability and the possibility of redemption. Edward himself had found a new purpose working as a clerk in the very bank he had once been expected to inherit. The work was humble and poorly paid compared to his former position, but it had provided him with opportunities to understand how financial institutions could serve ordinary families rather than simply enriching established elites. He had also become one of the most effective advocates for the Educational Foundation's programs, using his knowledge of local families to identify young people who could benefit from scholarship opportunities. Patrick Sullivan had adapted to the new order with the pragmatic flexibility that had made him successful in territorial banking. While he had been forced to transfer substantial assets to the Educational Foundation, he had also recognized that Victoria's development projects created business opportunities that more than compensated for his financial losses. The bank now operated according to lending practices that emphasized community development and individual opportunity rather than simply maximizing profits for wealthy depositors. I won't pretend that the transition was easy, Patrick Sullivan admitted during a conversation with visiting business leaders who wanted to understand how Millbrook Creek had achieved such rapid economic and social transformation. Victoria Blackwood forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about our past actions and current priorities. But the result has been a community that is more prosperous, more ethical, and more attractive to the kind of people and businesses that create lasting success. Margaret Sullivan had perhaps undergone the most dramatic personal transformation of anyone in the community. Her forced resignation from leadership positions in charitable organizations had initially been devastating to someone who had built her identity around claims of moral superiority and social prominence. But the restructuring of those organizations, according to principles of genuine service rather than paternalistic control, had revealed leadership capabilities that Margaret had never been encouraged to develop. She now served as Director of Family Services for the Regional Social Welfare Agency, working directly with families facing poverty, domestic violence, and other crises that the old charitable system had addressed through judgment and condescension rather than practical assistance. The work had been humbling but also transformative, teaching Margaret to see community problems through the eyes of those who experienced them rather than those who observed them from positions of privilege. I spent years believing that charity meant giving money to worthy causes while maintaining my own superior social position, Margaret reflected during an interview with a journalist who was documenting Millbrook Creek's transformation. Victoria Blackwood taught me that genuine service requires recognizing the humanity and potential of people you're trying to help, rather than simply managing their problems in ways that don't threaten your own comfort. The broader community had also evolved in ways that reflected Victoria's influence on social attitudes and institutional practices. The churches had adapted their approaches to moral guidance, emphasizing compassion and support for struggling individuals rather than judgment and exclusion. Local businesses operated according to employment practices that provided genuine opportunities for advancement, regardless of workers' family backgrounds or social connections. Most importantly, the community had developed mechanisms for accountability that prevented the kind of systematic persecution that Charlotte Murphy had experienced. A citizen oversight committee, composed of representatives from all economic and social groups, reviewed complaints about official misconduct or abuse of authority. Legal aid services funded through the Educational Foundation ensured that even the poorest residents had access to professional representation when facing civil or criminal proceedings. The changes had attracted national attention from reformers, journalists, and academics who studied Victoria's methods as a model for social transformation in other communities. Delegations visited regularly to observe how economic power could be used to advance social justice, how accountability mechanisms could be established without destroying community cohesion, and how traditional elite families could be integrated into more equitable power structures. What Victoria Blackwood accomplished in Millbrook Creek demonstrates that lasting social change requires more than good intentions or moral arguments, wrote Professor Elizabeth Harper of Columbia University in a widely circulated article about the community's transformation. It requires strategic thinking, economic leverage, and the patient construction of institutional frameworks that make justice sustainable rather than dependent on individual personalities. But perhaps the most meaningful measure of Victoria's success was evident in the generation of young people who had grown up under the new social order she had established. These children and teenagers understood that intelligence, determination, and moral courage were valued more highly than family connections or inherited wealth. They expected to be judged according to their own achievements and character, rather than their parents' social status. Victoria often observed these young people during community events, noting how they interacted with adults, how they approached problems, and how they talked about their future aspirations. They possessed a confidence and sense of possibility that had been rare among Millbrook Creek's youth during her own childhood, when social barriers had seemed insurmountable and individual potential had been constrained by circumstances of birth. We're raising a generation that takes justice and accountability for granted, Victoria told her daughter during one of their evening conversations about the Foundation's long-term goals. They've never known a community where powerful people could abuse their authority without consequences, where talented young people were limited by poverty or gender, or where moral leadership meant protecting privilege rather than serving others. Young Victoria nodded thoughtfully, understanding both the achievement that observation represented and the responsibility it created for maintaining the systems her mother had built. But we also need to ensure that they understand how fragile these gains are, she replied. Each generation has to choose whether to preserve and extend justice or allow it to erode through complacency and self-interest. As Victoria Blackwood prepared to step back from active management of the institution she had created, she could survey Millbrook Creek with the satisfaction of someone who had not merely achieved personal justice, but had transformed an entire community according to principles of genuine moral leadership. The frightened, powerless girl who had once been Charlotte Murphy had become the architect of a new social order that would continue benefiting future generations long after her direct involvement ended. The textile factory would continue employing hundreds of workers, according to progressive labor practices. The medical center would keep providing compassionate health care while training physicians who understood their moral as well as technical responsibilities. The educational foundation would maintain its commitment to identifying and developing exceptional minds regardless of social background or economic circumstances. Most importantly, the community had developed the institutional frameworks and cultural values necessary to prevent future injustices while encouraging the kind of innovation and moral leadership that create lasting prosperity. Victoria had proven that those who abuse their power will eventually face consequences, that victims of injustice need not remain powerless forever, and that entire communities can be transformed when confronted with superior moral vision backed by sufficient resources and determination. Standing at her office window overlooking the thriving town that bore little resemblance to the place that had once rejected her, Victoria Blackwood smiled with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had achieved something far more valuable than personal revenge. She had created justice, nurtured it through careful institution building, and passed it on to the next generation to carry forward into an uncertain but more hopeful future. The scared, pregnant child who had been driven from Millbrook Creek in shame would always be part of Victoria's story, but she was no longer its defining element. In her place stood a woman who had built a legacy of justice, accountability, and genuine moral leadership that would endure long after everyone who remembered Charlotte Murphy had passed into history. The circle was complete, but it was also expanding outward in ways that would continue touching lives not yet born and reshaping communities not yet imagined. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.